Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, The State of the EHS Industry. My name is James and I'll be your moderator for today's event. So before we dive into the presentation in the overall session, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail, and we'll walk through some housekeeping items here. Our session today looks at the year ahead from the perspective of your peers. As our speaker will discuss, you'll get an early look at the results of a recent survey we conducted to find out what the greatest trends, challenges, and priorities are for EHS professionals in 2016. Following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. And it is encouraged. We're going to save enough time at the end to address any questions you have. Please note that everyone's microphones will be turned off for the entirety of the webinar, but if you do have a question or a technical issue comes up, once again, you can use that questions pane to communicate. Finally, please keep in mind you will receive a copy of the slide deck and the recording within the next couple of days, so keep an eye out for these materials. As the head of marketing at Triumvirate Environmental, Warren Sekernick is responsible for the creation and implementation of all marketing, branding, communications, events, digital, and inbound lead generation. Warren's a seasoned marketing executive with a pattern of success in large businesses and startup companies. During his tenure at Triumvirate, we've grown the website capability, implemented the webinar series, and have launched many new programs. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Warren. Hey, Warren.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this important webinar on the state of EHS, your industry. Since looking at the registration list, I think we have a lot of people who may not be that familiar with Triumvirate Environmental. I wanted to just spend a couple minutes, talking about the company. So, like most of you, our focus is on EH&S management and services. We provide many different services, in EHS using almost 500 employees, with offices from Maine to Florida. Those services range from hazardous or medical waste disposal to field services, emergency response as an example, as well as professional services and consulting. The bulk of our work is really focused on 4 vertical markets: life sciences, education, primarily colleges and universities, healthcare, and industrial, a lot of big manufacturers. The company was founded in 1988, and we have a strong background throughout the industry of innovation and thought leadership. As an example of innovation, this is our 40th webinar over the past 12 months, which, as I think you'll all agree, is pretty unprecedented in this industry. We strongly believe in thought leadership and helping to educate and inform the industry on regulations, best practices, and other trends. And that's why we're all here today. So as far as an agenda on what I'm going to go through, we're going to talk about the survey methodology, demographics to start. Then we'll go into staffing and budgets, answering some of the questions, priorities and trends that you provided for 2016. We asked a few questions on technology and EH&S, and then summarize, kind of roll everything up, and then open the door for questions and answers. Okay, so let's talk about the research or the survey that we did. And what was our objective, in doing this? So this is our first survey of what we expect to be an annual project to help provide all of you, EHS professionals, with the knowledge and insight about upcoming trends and events that are impacting the industry. As a side note, in our research, prior to performing the research, we found that there really hasn't been much in the way of surveying the industry. So we wanted to really get a sense and listen to what environmental health and safety professionals had to say. Some of the goals that we had for the survey and the report were to take a snapshot of current EH&S professionals and the organizations that they represent, which will be the next slide when I talk to you about some of those demographics. Identify trends, regulations, and changes that impact your operations. And then, goal being to allow professionals and the companies that you all work for to benchmark those priorities and budgets against similar firms in the field. Okay. In terms of survey design, we asked respondents 22 questions, and they ranged from multiple choice to true, false, to scoring questions from like a 1 to 5 scale, as well as free-form answers. So we asked almost 200 people at the last 2 weeks of December. Those individuals came from our own database, so a lot of Triumvirate clients, as well as people who are prospects or have a relationship with us. And in addition to that, a good chunk came in who we didn't know, who are from beyond our region, who were solicited through posts that we placed on social media, which I think will be interesting since we have a section on social media. So let's get into it in a little more detail. Who took the survey, right? So as you can see on this first chart here on the left, the primary group was pretty broad and strong distribution, but the primary group that answered the survey were 38% were managers. When you add associates to that, that says 72% of our respondents, a little more than 2/3, were associate or managers. However, we also had a nice chunk of directors, 25%, and then senior leaders, C-levels, answered as well. That's pretty interesting. I think I had really broad distribution. In terms of what industries, we had some nice coverage across the 4 industries, that I mentioned that Triumvirate focuses on and services. The largest industry being the industrial group, and then second to that was higher ed, education. And in terms of how large the companies were that were represented, you see it's pretty broad too, from some very small respondents to very large, 21% over 5,000 employees. So if you were to kind of net it up, right, the typical respondent is a manager in the EHS department at a mid-sized industrial company that has between 100 and 500 employees. Over the course of this report, you'll see we noted where there were differences in responses based on either the industry that the survey came from or the experience level of that respondent, right? And also we asked them about departmental size, and most of the EHS professionals who took the survey have a department of 5 or less. Clearly this category of these large companies had a much larger sample size, departments over 30. All right, so let's get a little deeper, okay? And I think right here, James is going to ask you a poll question.
And I've just launched that poll, so we'll give everyone a few seconds. This should be a pretty easy one.
Okay.
Was environmental
health and safety your original career choice?
Okay, looks like pretty much everyone responded. So 75% said no, 25% yes. Let's see how that compares to survey results.
Interesting. And I think we're right in line in that we found that 56% of respondents, started with a different career choice, right? 38%, did focus on EHS from the very beginning, And I think we have, what is that? 80, a small percentage, 6% were unsure whether they started in EHS or not. That's my poor attempt at a joke, so apologize for that. The other thing, too, is we looked at, what department did they work in? And this was somewhat surprising in that only 50% of the EHS professionals worked in the EH&S department. The other half worked in either facilities or other departments that included operations, manufacturing, quality, lab management, and safety. So that's interesting. And one inference that you see on the bottom is, if you recall, we had a large percentage of respondents who were director and above. I think it was about 28, 29%, 27%. There we go. So even though it may not have been an original career choice, our inference is it's been a rewarding career because they've been able to grow and develop to become directors or even more senior managers or leaders in the field. Okay. So now we'll get into a little more meat and dive deep around, how you feel about staffing and budgets. Okay. So we asked quite a few questions on staffing, and this first question was an evaluation of, how you feel about, how staffed you are. And the surprising thing was over 2/3 of the responses came back that said their department is currently understaffed, right? 72% between these two buckets right here. That's quite a lot, right? And very few. No one really said, they were overstaffed, right? If anything, there were 26% were appropriately staffed. We also asked about budgets and growing of the department in terms of headcount. And interestingly enough, 73% of the audience, and that was pretty much, everyone, we asked, how do you expect the size of the department to change over the next year? And 65% anticipated the department size will remain the same. And as you can see, with that same question about budgets, 73% said the budgets weren't growing. Correspondingly, though, there is a good, big cross-section, 27%, who are growing the budgets, right? We also asked a question, over the course of the next year, how do you see your spending with contractors changing? And 90% of those respondents said they anticipate, the budget assigned to contractors and hiring practices remain the same. So no growth, right? To break it down a little further in terms of this staffing evaluation, we looked at the 4 different industries, that we cover, and they were all pretty significant in terms of being overstaffed. Higher ed being the largest at 83%. Healthcare was 79% overstaffed. Industrial 68%. And life sciences said, 58% say they were either very understaffed or slightly understaffed. So everyone, is really, I think, overworked based on looking at this and, kind of challenged to get things done. Okay? And then, as part of that, here's a quote, that kind of illustrates that, where someone said, whatever you can do to connect with engineering and management disciplines to understand the benefits and importance of EHS and sustainability to the bottom line would go a long way toward making an EHS professional's job more a part of the organization's goals and successes rather than looked on, this is a direct quote, as a cost-sucking enterprise. So, yeah, kind of illustrates the frustration, I think, with being overworked, understaffed, and not getting the resources that they need, right? So, as a result of that, you might be thinking, oh, geez, this isn't very good. So if the majority of environmental health and safety professionals feel their departments are understaffed and they aren't expected to grow over the next year, how do you keep up with the workload, right? Which is why we asked a series of questions on using contractors, right? So, we asked a bunch of questions, and the most popular reason for hiring contractors from the audience were they're more cost-effective than full-time hires. Typically, I think because of that second reason, it's easier to bring on short-term project-based work for a limited duration, and then leave. And then certainly other responses were specialized expertise, more efficient, and simpler. And to that point, while many employees within the departments recognize the need for more help in order to optimize for compliance, safety, and other hot topics, sometimes, often, contractors are used as a way to correct this understaffing. And we'll talk about some of those areas where you've been using contractors and think it makes sense. Okay? So what we found when we asked that question, right, that there are three types of activities, at a high level that make sense to use consultants based on this survey. One is regulatory training, which requires constant focus on industry updates and agency directives. So it certainly makes sense to outsource that and use some expert training organization, to do just that, because that's their focus and they're always on top of regulations, requirements, etc. Another project for consultants that really, in terms of these buckets, that seemed to really work was around complex, challenging, planning activities. And those planning activities could be anything from chemical hygiene, emergency response plan, maybe a GHS hazard plan, for example, or SPCC plan. And then the last piece, which really ties to the understaffed feeling, are cumbersome, time-consuming, and time-sensitive reporting, that there's a particular deadline that have to be done. A lot of you found that that's a good way to get help from consultant and can be approved. And examples of those are licensing and permitting, biennial reporting, and compliance audits. But clearly the largest one where consultants are used are in training. Okay? All right. So now let's talk about priorities and trends for 2016. Okay? And so this slide, this was a question where we basically asked freeform, type in any answer, what are your 2016 priorities and trends? And as you can tell by this, word cloud, it breaks it up into the individual words, and the biggest words are the ones that were most popular. So obviously EHS, was most popular term, so let's, discount that. But then here's another one: compliance, safety, regulations, regulatory, and you could see a bunch of, popular priorities and trends. I'm going to get into it a little more deeply. And then the smaller words, such as, here's one, planning and bargaining, not as important. So that's how that kind of looks. So now let's look at it, the top 5 by role. And there are some interesting, points here that we broke out to see if there are any differences between associates and managers, and then directors and C-level. And the top 5 were, for associates and managers, were regulatory compliance, safety and safety culture, training, cost savings, and waste management. And then correspondingly, for directors and C-levels, although the order was different, they were the same 5 things, right? Except for directors and C-levels, executive level employees, right? Their priority was more around safety, right? Whereas, since they probably don't have to do the reports, the regulatory compliance activities were number 2 rather than number 1. Training was always number 3, for example, right? So I think, what this tells us is safety, regulatory compliance and staffing, honestly, will be primary focuses in 2016, right? And also we asked, what are you challenged by? What keeps you up at night? And it was the same exact topics in very similar order. The one interesting thing or surprise to us was, we're all environmental professionals. Sustainability is important to us. But in terms of priorities and trends looking into 2016, that was way down the list, number 7, right? Except for one industry where it was number 2, and that industry was life sciences. So in life sciences, sustainability was certainly a lot more important and focused, and I think you can probably, maybe appreciate why within that industry. And I'll just go back to the other chart so you can see, relative to the other answers, here's sustainability over here, how much smaller it is compared to things like compliance and safety and regulations. Okay? And now let's drill down now on safety, because here's one of those questions where we broke it out a little further around safety culture and safety leadership, and we asked the question on a 5-point scale, where 5 was the most committed or best score. So the first question around safety leadership was, how committed is leadership to safety, right? And the average rating across all roles and all industries was 3.31, right? And then we also asked, how visible is management in safety leadership, right? And there, once again, it was almost as strong, 2.7. But now we said, well, do directors and senior leaders, when they're excluded from the survey, how does that change results? The numbers went way down, as you can see. We went down over 30% lower from 3.3 to 2, right, in terms of commitment, and almost in half in terms of visibility. So we think, this stat, really suggests that leadership needs to walk the walk, right, around commitment to safety and visibility rather than just talking about it, right? So non-directors, associates, and managers really feel that there's more room for improvement regarding safety. And it appears that high-level employees or leaders may have an inaccurate view of how their employees view safety culture at the organization. Okay? And then one quote from respondents regarding the safety culture and stuff said, we're very reactionary, at his company or her company, so I expect this trend to continue. Kind of interesting. And then another trend regarding, leadership and safety and compliance. Another quote says, maintaining EH&S visibility and the critical importance of safety and environmental compliance to senior executive leadership. EHS and its functions are taking a back seat to many other programs, and the department is being dispersed and diluted among other functions. And I think a lot of this we saw, through the other answers to the survey, such as being understaffed, such as the fact that a lot of our respondents work not in an EHS department, but interspersed in other departments, whether it's facilities or in the labs or something else like that. Okay. So now let's drill down a little into further on what topics are you most interested in learning about. So a little beyond just priorities and trends, but what's important to you that you feel you need to know more about. Similarly, no surprise there, compliance and regulatory, and then we have just regulatory training as another category. That was 41%. So changing regulations and an increased focus on compliance, are important and critical. But on an individual topic, safety is the most popular one. And then the other 29% of items are things like chemical inventory, sustainability, waste management. Interesting that sustainability, about, I think it's 10% of you want to learn about sustainability, yet it's 7th down on the priority list. So, and that I think goes to some of our core beliefs as EH&S professionals, right? Okay. So now, coming into the home stretch, I'm going to talk a little bit about technology in EH&S, how it's used, what it's used for, and things like that. And with that, James is going to ask you another poll question.
And that poll has just been launched. So this is our second of 2 polls that we're conducting here. And this one asks, what's the most important EH&S software you're using? And there's some options there that you can see: waste management, program management, compliance and reporting, chemical inventory, or other. So we'll give everyone a few more seconds here, and then we'll see what the response is. Okay, so it looks like the big winner is compliance and reporting at 37%, and then at 30% chemical inventory, 19% other, followed by waste management and program management.
Okay, and I'll show you how our survey answers correlate to that. So the most important software tool that you're using today, right? 34% chemical inventory, as well as 34% other. So that's just a conglomeration of that. So chemical inventory for our survey was the #1 tool or application. And then James, for this poll that we did, you had 37% in compliance and reporting, but in the survey that we sent out at the end of the year, that was only 17%. So kind of interesting. Things like program management, waste management, not a lot of people are using, different software applications for that, which I think is interesting, particularly compared, to other departments. Within EHS, we see, phones and other technology, phones which is more like a handheld computer, right, as a way to improve and simplify EH&S tasks, as well as conceivably, could be a safety hazard if we're too distracted by our phones, but at least helps us to identify some other safety hazards as well. Okay. Now let's talk about social media. So we asked the audience, which social media platform do you spend the most time in? And how do you really learn, right? And LinkedIn is the most popular social network for EH&S professionals. I don't think that's any surprise, and that LinkedIn, I think, is the most popular social network for all business professionals from a business perspective, right? And then in terms of another question, 60% of you get your updates from webinars, and 39% from LinkedIn. That was a little bit surprising to me, and it certainly made me feel good since, over the past year and a half, we've implemented this webinar program. So a lot of you find value in the webinars that you're getting your updates from programs such as this one, right? And then certainly EH&S professionals see the increasing, prevalence and usage of technology in their everyday life. So in just a couple of key points, I think the popularity of LinkedIn, suggests that, EH&S professionals prefer to communicate with like-minded peers, other professionals, to find solutions to work-related problems, whether that's sharing things on LinkedIn through status updates or links to articles that they find, or I know a lot of our employees participate in a lot of groups and forums, which play a large role in gaining information. Okay? And finally, I'm going to summarize the report findings, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. Okay. So, a couple of key findings, that we had is, EH&S is an often underappreciated and understaffed function. Across every industry, every role, that point was made loud and clear. Safety and regulatory compliance continue to be priorities. I think, they always have been and probably always will be. Technology use is growing, but still pales compared to other departments, right? And another big surprise to us was sustainability is on people's minds, but it's certainly not a priority in terms of getting up the chart in the organization's goals. We think, a big part of that may be because, we're so hard-pressed to expand staff, right? And just keeping up, with the must-dos doesn't enable us or allow us to really prioritize, on sustainability. So, just as kind of a final statement, I would say, we found this survey to be very useful and invaluable to us. We looked at challenges, priorities, and trends with the associated demographics and questions to provide you with what you need to know for the upcoming year. It really provided us with valuable insight on where the industry is heading in terms of technology and sustainability, and then, of course, safety culture, regulatory compliance, and more. So certainly the primary motivator for everyone, seems to be finding creative solutions to budgeting and staffing issues within EH&S departments, yet at the same time, gaining management buy-in and support. And I think with that, James, I'm going to turn it back to you and open it up to questions.
Sure, thanks, Warren. So, yeah, we've got plenty of time here for some questions, so feel free to type it into the questions box. I know we have a few that are waiting in the queue that we can get started with right away. But this is a lot of information, so I encourage you to ask Warren some more details surrounding the methodology, the results, or whatever's on your mind, and we'll address that. So, Warren, let's start with a couple that are here. The first does get at the question that we covered early on, which was the methodology of the survey. And you talked about, we sent this to clients and also others outside of our database. Can you speak to the geographic reach?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
So as we mentioned earlier, although Triumvirate, service reach is East Coast, from Maine to Florida, we certainly got a lot of answers from that group or people who work in those geographies. However, I think because of our reputation as an industry leader and thought leadership by going to events, webinars, etc., we've gotten quite a large following across the country, over the past year. So I would say, if I had to break it out geographically, maybe 25–30% of respondents, James, came from outside, our traditional markets.
Right.
And there were even a few international respondents.
Great. So pretty representative. Of course, based on where we work, leaning a bit
Right.
East Coast, but sure, that's great. And I think that should answer the question there that was asked by that attendee. Let's talk a little bit more. This question gets at, you mentioned other surveys, and there aren't a whole lot out there in the industry, but there may be a few. So how do these results compare to those industry surveys and other benchmarks that exist?
Great question, James. So there are two surveys that we're aware of that were performed this past year. One is from an organization, NAEM, who a lot of you may be familiar with, right? National Association of Environmental Management. And that survey was around career profiles of EHS and sustainability professionals. And there was a strong deep dive into their roles and responsibilities and how long, they had worked in the field, right? So certainly we only asked one, maybe two questions around role and what department they work in, and that was really the whole focus of that survey. So, however, one question that we did ask that I don't think they addressed, which I'd like to do a follow-up deep dive on in our next survey, was that question on was EH&S your first or primary original career choice, right? No one's asked that, and then I'd like to learn what attracted you to EH&S and how long then they've obviously worked in the field. And then there's another survey that we came across by a company called Verdantix, right, which is an international consulting and technology vendor in the EH&S field. That was around global EHS survey and attitudes. The survey was a little larger than ours. They're a UK-based company. So the survey was a little larger than ours, at about 300 and so respondents, but it was global and international. So in that case, although a lot of the trends around safety and regulatory, I think were similar, there was a much stronger focus and perspective on sustainability, because I think, Europe certainly, has been way ahead of us here in the U.S. with a focus on sustainability.
Sure, that makes sense. And
those are the only two. Yeah, those are the only two surveys that really address this to any large degree that we found, that we're aware of.
Great, and we were talking a bit about sustainability, maybe some surprise there as to where that ranked. And you talked a bit about it being more of a priority in the life sciences industry. So besides sustainability and staffing, were there any other nuances or notable differences between industries that you noticed?
Between industries, a couple things were, some of the priorities were a little different in terms of order. Safety was of paramount importance to everyone. The delta on the safety culture between management, and associates, I think was consistent across the board. So, yeah, I think for the most part, there was a lot of consistency across all industries, other than what we've noted, like with life sciences, for example.
Sure.
And then the other thing in terms of being understaffed, a few of the industries felt that they were way understaffed, like education, and healthcare. Education had the highest percentage of being understaffed at 82%, and life science was 58%.
Right, and that's a huge difference compared to other questions.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe in a follow-up we can dive in and see what some other thoughts are there. But hey, we're getting up on quarter of. I think we've got about one more question here. So I'll say if anyone has anything remaining, feel free to send it along. Otherwise, we can follow up with you afterwards if something comes to mind. So we'll take one, maybe two more. Warren, this one is kind of a question that gets to your reaction when looking through the survey. Was there anything that surprised you the most? If not, I guess this might be consistent with what you thought, but was there anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we could really drill down into, deeply. One thing is, as I mentioned, that gap around safety culture. I think that's really worth exploring and improving, or diminishing that gap will be interesting. And then also, we ask very detailed questions around, all different kinds of work activities based on our suspicion about being, understaffed or overworked. Would you consider or hire consultants for these activities? And for the majority, the percentage, even though they felt understaffed, was not much consideration for consultants. Mm. So that was somewhat of a surprise because typically they go hand in hand. Right. Right, and that was pretty low. So here's the last question. Here's a good one that talks about technology. How willing are the companies to spend money on technology to automate some of the EHS processes? That's a great question that we should have asked. I think we should do that, for next year. But clearly, having worked in technology for the bulk of my life, right? Productivity improvements, right? And whether in the form of savings or incremental revenue or efficiencies and operational improvements are really what justifies the investments and get software implemented. So I think that, implementing some sort of enterprise-wide application, like a waste management application, for example, or perhaps chemical inventory as was a popular choice. I think by demonstrating those operational efficiencies, I think that's the way to get them implemented, and then get the staffing balanced again and improved. Good question. Thanks. We'll make a note of that and make sure to ask that next year. Right. Like you said, we're going to do this on an annual basis. So we'll continue to build on what we've started here. So Warren, I think this is a good time to start to wrap things up. Really appreciate the presentation. Everyone who attended today will get a copy of not only the presentation, but also the report that Warren detailed here in some of his insights and analysis. We also have some additional webinars coming up. As you may have noticed, we're running them on pretty much a weekly basis now. So coming up next week, we have an introduction to peroxide formers, and following that, an OSHA inspection preparation webinar. So more details to follow, and I hope to see you at one or both of those events. The always popular OSHA webinar. We've done it actually we've done both of these several times, and they're very popular. So make sure you register early. Yep. And so that's that. And with that, do you have anything else to add, Warren, before we start to close down here? No, I really appreciate your participation, both attending this webinar and maybe even several of you took part in the survey. So thank you very much. I found it very enlightening. I hope that you did, and we will send you a copy of the report next week, and hopefully you can use that to help guide some of your direction and conversations, moving forward into 2016. So thank you very much. Very good. And there's a few of those resources that you will receive, including a survey. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your attention and participation. Have a great one. Thanks. Take care.